Hello, everyone. My dad tells a story about when he was a young man and had a confrontation with a werewolf on his way to the farm. My dad's name is John. He says that when he worked at Hope Farm in Texas, a werewolf came after him because of the milk he was transporting to the city. At the time, he was 19 years old and responsible for delivering the milk by cart every day at around 4 a.m. He would head to the farm where the milk cans were already filled. Mr. Ben, a farmhand, helped him load the cart. Once everything was set, my dad would head to the city. One day, he had one last delivery to make at Mr. Nelson's grocery store. When he stopped the cart in front of the store, there was a man lying on the sidewalk. He didn't seem like a homeless person, just a drunk who was recovering from a night of heavy drinking. As my dad got off the cart, he waved at the man and said, "Good morning, sir." The man got up and replied, "Good morning. What do you have there, young man?" "I have milk for Mr. Nelson. It's fresh," my dad responded. The man, still unsteady, approached my dad and asked if he could have a cup of the milk. My dad was uncomfortable because the exact amount of milk Mr. Nelson had ordered was in the can. If he gave some away, Mr. Nelson might complain to the farm owner. So, reluctantly, my dad replied, "Sir, I would if it were mine, but this milk is Mr. Nelson's order. If I take any, I might lose my job." The man didn't take kindly to this response and muttered, "People in this city are so stingy." The man went into the grocery store to ask Mr. Nelson for milk, but was met with hostility. Mr. Nelson shouted, "Get out of here, you vagrant! I don't give milk to bums. Get away from my store." The man began cursing at Mr. Nelson and my dad, using many foul words. As he walked past the cart, he slapped the horse's hindquarters, causing it to bolt. Fortunately, my dad had already unloaded the milk cans, but he still had to chase the horse, which only stopped near the town square. After catching the horse, my dad returned to the grocery store to collect the payment. Inside, he saw Mr. Nelson talking seriously to an old man who had witnessed the entire incident. The old man warned Mr. Nelson and my dad, "You guys are crazy. How could you refuse a cup of milk to that man? You're looking for trouble." My dad asked, "Why do you say that, sir?" The old man replied, "Didn't you see how the horse ran off and how scared it was? There's a saying that sometimes Jesus disguises himself as a beggar to test men's kindness, but not always. Sometimes it's not Jesus, but something else, testing a man's courage." Mr. Nelson made the sign of the cross, and my dad was puzzled. He took the money and returned to the farm. There, he told Mr. Ben everything that had happened. Mr. Ben, an old and experienced man, warned him, "John, I've seen a lot in my time. They say good advice should be sold, not given. But I like you, so he'll tell you this. That man who wanted the milk is trouble. If I were you, I'd ask the boss to change your job for a few days until things calm down." My dad said he wasn't afraid of threats and that he didn't give the milk simply because it wasn't his to give. Some time passed. About 20 days later, one early morning, my dad was taking the loaded cart down those bumpy roads. It was still very dark, and the horse was calm. My dad had almost forgotten about the incident. As he passed by Mr. Ernest's cornfield, the horse became agitated, lowering its ears and neighing loudly. Suddenly, heavy footsteps and the sound of breaking corn stalks could be heard. The horse started running, and my dad struggled to control it. Milk cans began to spill and fall from the cart. It was chaos. In a flash, my dad felt something heavy grabbing the back of the cart. When he looked, he saw a hairy creature with red eyes and large, protruding teeth, trying to climb onto the cart. Panic took over as he realized he was alone on that road with a werewolf. The creature was only a few feet away, opening its massive jaws, ready to bite. My dad started shouting for help. The horse reared up, causing the cart to tip over on top of the beast. My dad fell and rolled to the side of the road. Without wasting any time, he got up and ran as fast as he could toward Mr. Ernest's farm, not daring to look back, only hearing the werewolf pursuing him. When he saw the farm gate, he also saw Mr. Ernest with a shotgun in his hands. Mr. Ernest shouted, "Jump the gate. John, run. Don't stop." My dad began climbing the gate, which was a bit high. Mr. Ernest fired 2 shots into the air. My dad fell on the other side, and they both ran to the farmhouse. In seconds, Mr. Ernest's dogs, 6 brave hounds, began fighting with the werewolf that had invaded the property. Despite its strength and agility, the creature couldn't escape their bites. It tried to flee, but the dogs wouldn't let it. As the first light of day appeared, the beast, unable to escape, began to howl and snarl in pain, sounding like a crying dog. In the midst of the confusion, the werewolf started to revert to its human form. Mr. Ernest and my dad watched this macabre scene from the window. Seeing that the werewolf was no longer a threat, and that the dogs were about to kill the man, Mr. Ernest stepped outside, fired 2 more shots into the air, and whistled for his dogs. The dogs obeyed and backed off. Mr. Ernest and my dad slowly approached the injured man. He was in bad shape. The dogs had done a good job. Pointing the shotgun at him, Mr. Ernest asked, "Who are you, and why were you chasing John?" The man could barely speak, only asking for help. My dad recognized him immediately and quickly told Mr. Ernest the whole story. Mr. Ernest wanted to finish the man off right there, as a werewolf on the loose was very dangerous. But my dad stopped him, suggesting they hand him over to the authorities instead. Reluctantly, Mr. Ernest agreed. He sent a farmhand to the city to get the police. The 2 men guarded the werewolf man until the authorities arrived. The police initially didn't believe the story, but eventually got a confession from the man, who admitted he was a werewolf and begged to be let go, promising never to return. The police took the man away in handcuffs. My dad was very lucky to have survived that encounter, and he is forever grateful to Mr. Ernest for helping him in such a difficult moment. It's unclear what the authorities did with the man, but he and the werewolf were never seen again. This case became well known in our region, and to this day, people seek my dad out to hear the story from him. I hope you enjoyed my dad John's experience. Good night. Good night. My name is Andrew, and I have a creepy story to share. In this case, it was my mother who witnessed the events, and she still tells us about them to this day. I'll tell it as if I were her. When I was a teenager, around 14 or 15 years old, I lived on a farm with my parents and sisters. It was a place with many small farms, but the one we lived on wasn't ours. It belonged to the late Mr. Miller. My parents rented this farm, and about half a mile away, there were other farms, one of which was owned by Mr. Miller himself. This was about 40 years ago in rural Ohio. When we moved there, we made friends with all the neighbors, including Mr. Miller, who liked our family very much. He said we were good tenants and often visited our farm in the afternoons to chat with my parents. He shared stories about his life and struggles. My mom also befriended some of the local women, including Mrs. Betty, who soon became her best friend. One day, Mrs. Betty brought up a topic about Mr. Miller. She told us that the old man was cursed, and there were rumors that he had made a pact with the devil in exchange for wealth and pleasure. She said that during full moons and Lent, Mr. Miller would disappear for days, and sometimes the livestock on nearby farms would be attacked by a large animal. She also said that because of his lustful nature, he could get any woman he wanted, usually very young ones. But his marriages never lasted long. The women would leave or disappear after a short time. I was listening intently to everything Mrs. Betty was saying and became very scared when she said, "Look, to me, that old man turns into a werewolf, but since no one has ever seen it, there's no proof. But pay attention to his behavior." From that day on, my mom, my sisters and I started to be very afraid of the old man and to watch his actions more closely. Indeed, he was very odd. He had calloused and cracked hands, elbows, knees, and feet. He was always scratching himself as if he had mange, had a strange smell, and his teeth were yellow and broken. During the first full moon we experienced at the farm, my mom said, "Let's keep an eye on him to see if he disappears. If he does, Mrs. Betty is right, and that old man is a werewolf." Sure enough, the next day, after the full moon, we passed by his farm, and it was all locked up. My mom called out a few times, but there was no response. Mr. Miller had disappeared and only showed up 2 days later. When he visited our house, he had some bruises. After chatting for a while, he suddenly turned to my mom and said, "Mrs. Maria, did you come by my place looking for me? Did you need anything?" My mom tried to cover up, saying she just wanted to check if he was okay. We were surprised he knew we had been there. Some time passed, and my Aunt Lisa came to live with us. She was my dad's sister, young, single, and very beautiful. When Mr. Miller saw Aunt Lisa, he became very interested in her. She found him repulsive and hated that he kept hanging around trying to talk to her. But something inexplicable happened that Christmas. My dad, out of consideration, invited Mr. Miller to join us for dinner. My mom didn't want to, but my dad insisted, saying the old man was lonely and it wouldn't hurt to share with him. That night, Mr. Miller showed up with a bottle of wine and insisted on serving everyone, especially Aunt Lisa, who he insisted should drink first. She did, and he laughed with joy. After dinner, he gave her a perfume, which smelled awful, like crushed weeds. She didn't care for it and left it on top of the wardrobe. However, after that night, Aunt Lisa changed completely. It was as if she was enchanted by that old man. Every afternoon, she would get ready and put on that stinky perfume, knowing he would visit. My mom tried to warn her about the rumors, but she was completely smitten. A couple of months later, Aunt Lisa told my parents she was moving in with Mr. Miller. We were all shocked. How could she want to be with him? But she was of age, so she moved to his farm with all her belongings. Over the months, we noticed Aunt Lisa getting very thin and looking sick, but she refused any help, insisting she was fine. Not long after, we heard that Mr. Miller was also sick and bedridden. They wouldn't even accept visitors. One night, while we were sleeping, we woke up to Aunt Lisa banging on the door. My dad rushed to open it, and she came in, terrified and crying. We all gathered in the living room to find out what was happening. She said she had been sleeping on the couch, leaving the bed for the very sick Mr. Miller. She woke up to a growling noise from the bedroom. Thinking he was in trouble, she checked, and when she pulled back the curtain, the room had no door, just a curtain. She saw a demon sitting on Mr. Miller's chest. It was a black, skinny, and tall creature with horns and a long tongue, choking him. She started screaming and ran away. We were all scared by what she told us. Crying, she said she wouldn't go back to that farm because Mr. Miller was cursed. The next day, my dad went with her to get her things. Mr. Miller didn't want to let her go, saying if she left, he would die sooner. He begged her to stay, promising she would inherit all his wealth, but she didn't care. The following week, Aunt Lisa left town. When Mr. Miller found out, he came to our house. He was very sick, covered in sores, and smelled awful. He was so weak he could barely walk. He started arguing with my parents, accusing them of convincing Aunt Lisa to leave him, cursing us and calling us names. The old man was possessed. That night, in the middle of the night, we woke up to distant cries for help. My dad, worried, thought a neighbor was in trouble. He grabbed a machete and decided to go check. We all went with him, carrying lanterns. Following the cries, we realized they were coming from Mr. Miller's farm. We hurried, but before entering the property, we saw Mrs. Betty, her husband, and 2 other neighbors. They were terrified, staring towards the fence. When Mrs. Betty saw us, she shouted, "Run! Come here! Come see!" Didn't I tell you that old man had a pact with the devil? Look at what's happening. We saw something supernatural happening. I don't like to talk about it to avoid attracting bad things, but I'll tell you, in Mr. Miller's yard, there was a creature that looked like a mix between a monkey and a dog, walking upright. I couldn't see its face clearly from a distance, but it was definitely the work of the devil. It was dragging Mr. Miller by the hair. The old man was struggling and screaming for help. My dad wanted to help, but Mrs. Betty and the others told him not to, saying it was the devil incarnate. The beast dragged Mr. Miller into the woods, followed by a pack of dogs. We ran back home, unable to do anything. The fear of what we saw haunted us for years. The next day, the news had spread. Mr. Miller's farm was crowded with people trying to find out what happened. Inside, everything was trashed and broken. The door was smashed, and a blood trail led from the bedroom to the edge of the woods. Some neighbors ventured into the woods to look for Mr. Miller, but he was nowhere to be found. He had disappeared completely. This is a true story, not something I heard from someone else. I saw it with my own eyes. Since then, I have never seen a werewolf again, but these things do exist, without a doubt. Good night.